Hope you guys are good. My name is Mark Beebe, and Director of Recovery at Cokesbury. I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, and I struggle with codependency. We're going to continue our talks this week about grief. Alex started us off last week with an introduction to what grief and loss are all about, and how wide that net is for experiences that we have in our lives. I would encourage you to go back to recoverycokesbury.com if you missed that talk and watch what he was talking about it by way of an introduction of what this series is going to be all about, and take a look at that. I want to ask you guys to pray with me. Sweet Jesus, thank you so much for this time together. We love you. It's important for you to come and speak into us. Bring us a fresh breath. And so we know you're going to do that tonight. Just open us to taking that breath. In your sweet name we pray, amen. Before we get started, I want to encourage you in the next days, literally days, to pay attention to all of our social media for Recovery at Cokesbury. Hopefully we're going to be having some more new information for you, and so pay attention to that in the next days. It'll be all over the place in addition to being on our website at recoverycokesbury.com. So pay attention to those outlets, and hopefully we'll have some news for you soon. I want to talk tonight about understanding grief. What the depth of the grief experience is really all about. And to get started, I want to give you a comparative. So here's what it is. Mourning, what's the difference between the word or the experience of mourning and the experience of grief? Well, mourning is the outside, the external expression of what's going on inside with grief. So mourning is the external expression of the internal grief experience that we go through when we have had a loss in our lives, whether it's a loss of a dream, loss of a job, loss of a loved one, friend, and we'll talk for a minute about what loss of addiction is all about, or our loss of our compulsion is all about. But mourning is that outward sadness that we show. And most people that we are with in friendships or relationships get very uncomfortable with the outward mourning expression that we go through, and they just want us to get over it, want us to get through it, and mostly because there's two reasons why that is. Number one, they would like life, principally theirs, to get back to normal. And number two, it's uncomfortable when some of the feelings you're having that you're expressing outwardly during mourning are feelings that they are probably having with some unresolved grief of their own internally, and so they would like to be able to avoid that. That's why when there is, for example, the loss of a loved one, you get 2 freezers full worth of casseroles, good or bad, 2 freezers full worth of casseroles or dinners or whatever for the first 2 or 3 weeks after the loss experience, and then you never see another casserole again. You never do. And so, what's that all about? Well, what that's all about is after 3 weeks or whatever it is, most people would like life to get back to normal and like to not have to think about their own unresolved grief that's going on inside of themselves, because they've long since put the external mourning away. So mourning is acceptable for a while. And so part of mourning, some of the physical stuff is people are out of sorts, they're sad, they cry, they don't sleep well, they don't eat well, they're quiet, they're a little bit isolating maybe. And so people accept kind of all of those experiences physically and emotionally as being, that person's in mourning, and they're in mourning for, that whopping 3 weeks or whatever. But grief is something completely different. First of all, there is no timeline for grief. There is no perfect process. There is no normal way of doing it. There is no way to make it predictable. There is no way to go, well, yeah, you're here, and in a year you'll be here. A lot of people just get started with the grief process after a year. Grief is what we carry around on the inside of us. And it's the part of the loss experience that nobody but us sees. It's the part that we suffer with. It's the part that we struggle with. It's the part that we try to keep to ourselves, and it's the part that we try to put on our game face for in order to help other people and ourselves avoid that. So grief, a good quote I thought was, grief is like a fickle mistress. You know, it's kind of like love me not. It's kind of like always kind of around, always challenging other parts of my life, always intervening in other parts of my life, always compromising the sense of security and safety and well-being that I have. So in recovery, something we don't talk about a lot, but it's true, is that in recovery from a compulsion, most of us learn to have a legitimate, as we saw it, confidence in our compulsion. We gained confidence in alcohol, drugs, sex, pornography, codependency, gambling, eating, not eating, whatever. We gained a sense of confidence in the comfort that we believed our compulsion gave us. And for some of us, there were some positives to that compulsion as we saw it. We had other people that were like us. We enjoyed other fellowships where it sort of helped us to be more comfortable. All that was kind of happening. And the confidence factor in how do I accommodate my emotions and how do I accommodate my feelings? How do I avoid my emotions? How do I avoid my feelings? You know, it's significant. And so you get into recovery and you begin to get some sober time away from your compulsion. And it is a phenomenon that we sometimes miss some of the pieces of that compulsion that were for a while, as we saw it, our friend. We kind of miss the confidence that our friend brought to us, or maybe we miss the kind of people that we were hanging out with, you know, in our compulsion, in active addiction especially. We kind of miss being with them. So we're in the middle of getting sober. The people in our life that we were around are not, and so we're kind of the odd woman out, or we're kind of the odd man out. There's a grief in that, and it's considerable, and it's significant. It's a piece of what we're carrying around on the inside. Grief, even including that conversation about compulsion, grief is love really with no place to go. So I love something, I love somebody, I love my job, I love my work experience, I love a relationship that I'm in, I loved might have been having struggles in a marriage, but I loved that person. Maybe I still love them. And now in that loss of them, I don't really have any place to go. Like one question that came out of our talk on getting ready for this talk was, do we love people and do we grieve people that hurt us? I mean, I think that's yes and yes. That's a longer conversation that'll come at the back part of this series when we start talking about more specifics about healing from grief. But do we grieve people in our lives? Parents, siblings, friends, whoever, do we grieve people in our lives that hurt us? And what do we do about that? You know, I think one of the problems with grief and why it's important for us to get this conversation going in this series is that grief is kind of an unspoken enemy and an unspoken challenge to sobriety. Grief that we aren't actually working on, or we don't know how to work on, or we're trying to suffer with silently and suffer with in isolation, it really can do a number on increasing levels of resentment. It really can do a number on me feeling emotionally and spiritually insecure. It really can begin to especially affect, I think, my relationship with God, which is why we keep talking about the fact that recovery, is a spiritual, in the end, it's a spiritual enterprise. Whether you see yourself as spiritual or not, it's a spiritual enterprise that has everything to do with the question of what is really going on between you and God. But for most of us, we want to try to put this piece of challenge the grief away. Put it in a cabinet, put it away, because we're more attractive to other people if we don't talk about this. And so internal grief, it's almost always untapped, it's almost always unspoken, and we tend to try to live with it by ourselves. After 6 months or 8 months or 10 months or a year and a half of going through a grief experience, maybe you're going to ask the question, why does this hurt so much? How come this has to hurt so much? It hurts so much for a bunch of reasons. I mean, the missing of this person or this experience, that's obvious. But then it's also, how do I work through what is unresolved in what happened when this person left or this job left or whatever? What pieces were unresolved in that exchange, in that relationship with whatever? And that's why we go, that work is messy, it's hard, it's up and down, it's forward and then back. It's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's all of that. Sometimes it feels like it's 6 steps back. You're never really sure why you feel the way you feel when you feel it, what things kind of trigger grief emotions. Someone that was in our group that helps us develop messages was talking about the fact that innocently enough, for some reason, cutting the grass is a trigger for him that causes a grief response in his life. So it's like it hurts so much because we can't really predict how we're going to feel. We don't really know how to walk our way through it. There is no timeline or perfect way of doing this. There isn't even really a set of predictable guides. It is an experience that we go through because we're human beings. And I think it's also true that none of us, whether it's relationships or whatever, none of us enjoy the constraints of mortality. We don't like anything being mortal. We don't like the idea that anything is going to be taken from us. We don't like something as simple as you go to a restaurant and it's your favorite restaurant and you walk in there and you don't even really need to look at the menu because you know what you want and you know what you're going to have. So they come and take your order. The server comes and takes your order and they go, what would you like tonight? And you go, I would like to have this. And they go, well, I'm sorry, but we don't have that on their menu anymore. And then you go, well, do you think you can still make it for me? And they go, I'm sorry, but we really can't do that. Man, that's a little piece of mortality. And if you ratchet that up to a higher and higher and higher and higher level of value, and it involves especially people, I think you see why we struggle inside and unnecessarily, but alone for so long and for so often. But I just want to make sure we understand, there really is no perfect way to do this. We all are going to go about it in different ways. We all are going to experience it in different ways. And I tell you that also for all of us in the room, all of us that are listening to this, to know that, don't feel some kind of a burden when you're with a friend who is going through some grief that you've got to move them along, or they aren't on the track that you think they ought to be on, or they aren't on some timeline that you have made up for them, because it doesn't exist. Parts of the grief experience that most people, I think, do suffer alone with because they're afraid to talk about it is inability to just function. You find yourself maybe taking a personal day, and then a week later feeling like you need to take another personal day. Then maybe you got to take a personal week, and then maybe you believe that, like we do, that a change of scenery is going to help, except it doesn't. Maybe you believe that, getting away for a week will help, except it doesn't. Maybe that brings even more flashpoints or even more triggers that were unexpected. And you come back from vacation and, lo and behold, you feel worse. Inability to focus is a piece of what happens to us with grief. Memory, not being able to remember things. Where did I put my keys? I forgot about that appointment. I forgot I was supposed to be here. I forgot I was supposed to do that. I forgot about this bill, whatever. People generally don't report stuff like this or talk about it to anybody else. So we become more and more held captive by these experiences that we're having alone because we believe that it's embarrassing or unfair or whatever we think, or people won't want to be around us if we talk about this. People talk often about believing that they're hearing a loved one maybe in a room right beside them. They're watching TV, and for some reason they think they're hearing the loved one that they lost. Maybe they're having visions of a loved one being around them. Maybe they think for a while that there's someone that's walking toward them is that person or whatever. I mean, that they look just like them, or they think they look just like them, or whatever. Those kinds of visions. Dreams, having intense dreams about somebody that you have lost. I know for me, a couple of months after my dad was killed in a car accident, I started having very vivid dreams where he was talking to me. He was always sitting in the same place. It seemed like several days went by when we were doing this. We would talk about all kinds of things about his life, mine, that we honestly had never talked about before. And I did not tell my mom because I didn't want to upset her, which is kind of how we do this grief work. We're very concerned about everybody else, including not wanting other people to feel what we feel, so we keep it to ourselves. So I definitely kept that to myself. Worried about it a lot, was anxious about what were those dreams going to mean? Were they ever going to stop? What was going to happen? Oddly enough, levels of comfort, but I never told anybody about it. First person I ever told about it was a sibling of mine, and she goes, I'm having that same thing happen to me. I couldn't believe it. It took us at least a year, either one of us to ever talk to our mom about it, because, again, better to keep it to yourself, better to keep it private. Over-functioning is a piece of grief response that we see all the time with people trying to do so much, like change this, do this, do that, lose weight, do this, all that trying to create an avoidance of what's actually happening by over-functioning. There's a fear factor involved in dealing with grief. You go through this litany, especially when you lose, what could be true really for job loss or people or anything in between. The fear of, what should I have done to avoid this loss? What could I have done to avoid this loss? What would I have done if I knew that was going to happen? If I would have only said, in the case of people, if I would have only said to him or her, again, how much I love them or how much I care for them. If I would have only settled what was wrong with our relationship, if I would have tried to explain what was going on, if I would have only tried, to make things right, or however you want to put that, and to release that fear of grief, you gotta kind of not just go, well, put it away, put it on a shelf, but you really gotta walk back into that. And we'll talk a lot more at the conclusion of this series about how do you actually heal from grief. Like, what do you do about those fears of what you could have done, what you should have done, all that sort of emotional and even spiritual backtracking. How do you release the fear of that grief? That's what we'll be talking about in that later week. Grief, for sure, starts to get better, and we begin to get some moving forward capacities when we do, with regard to that issue of what I should have done, could have done, put that into what we call a fifth step, meaning maybe I really should risk it and talk to somebody else about this who I trust, who loves me, who I know is not going to judge me. Maybe I really should talk to God about what is happening and some of the things that I'm most afraid of with what I left undone in that relationship or job or whatever. But, that fifth step experience of get it out there, get it in front of somebody else. Don't continue to suffer alone, and don't continue to try to figure out some way to conjure up the self-care necessary to be able to kind of take at least a baby step forward. Grief isn't, despite our best efforts, grief really is not happening in solitude because we grieve the other. We grieve the other. So it's not a solitude experience. It doesn't happen in solitude, and it can't be healed in solitude. Grief is about the loss of a relationship, and it's going to require a relationship to heal, whether it's a person, a place, or a thing that you're grieving. It's a relationship with that person, place, or thing, and it's going to require a relationship from somewhere in your life for you to begin to heal. You know, how do I take a step where someday I'm actually remembering what I lost more with love, or more with an affection, or more with a contentment or a peace than the pain that I'm experiencing right now? How do I kind of merge what I lost with what my life is like now? And how do I move that experience of grief fully into the present and then fully into the future? How do I, this is what we're going to talk about more as this series goes along, how do I get to a place of what we're going to call active memory? I remember what I lost in my life. I remember the friend, the loved one, the job, the experience, whatever it is. I remember that experience in an actual place in my life where I'm not trying to push it away, but I can learn to take what is bringing me some peace and contentment from that and move forward with that as a part of my life. So the object isn't that losing my dad, isn't that I need to forget my dad. I need to forget the relationship I had with my dad. I need to forget what it was like to be his son. But now I can move beyond the pain that loss caused me, and I can have an active memory of my dad and remember what it was like for him to be, present in my life, and what it's like for his memory to be present in my life now. How do I get to that place? And if you're smack dab in the middle of grief, this is going to seem unimaginable to you. Some of the things we just talked about are going to seem like that really isn't possible. I don't know how I'm ever going to get there. I want you to keep watching this series and keep paying attention to what we're talking about, especially this stuff when we get to the full-on piece about healing from grief. And you're going to get even more pragmatics like this, like the active memory piece, and even more pieces of how do you begin to deliberately heal from a loss experience. Psalm 34 puts it like this. This is a confidence that we can have in God not only understanding our grief, but also being ready and willing and able to address us. The Lord, it says, hears his people when they call to him for help. He rescues them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. If you're in the middle of a grief experience tonight, that's you. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. If you feel like nobody understands, if you don't hear anything else tonight, I want you to hear from that piece of what God has to say. God's raising his hand tonight going, I do understand. I do understand what it's like to grieve. If you read the section of the second half of the Bible, the pieces in the Gospels, the stories that talk about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you read those pieces of those books where there is conversation about the death of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. I want you to read specifically. I want you to look at the reaction and the response of God the Father dealing with the loss of his son. You cannot read those stories and not accept the truth that, you know what, God is in this with us. He does understand our crushed souls. He's had one. He does understand our brokenheartedness. He's had that. And he's coming to be with us, sit with us, patiently be there for us, sometimes not needing to say anything at all. That's the loving Father that we have. That's the beginning, I think. I really think that understanding of God, and not God being a God of going, get over it, let's move on, that understanding of the compassion of God is a big deal in taking the first baby steps maybe toward healing from grief. Thanks so much for being a part of this talk tonight. Love you, and hopefully we'll catch up with each other soon. In Jesus' sweet name, amen.